Bruce Daisley. I mean, amazing stuff. You're one of the most influential voices out there on fixing work. You've got a best-selling business book. It's been translated a bunch of different places. You were at Twitter for a long time, running vast quantities of Twitter around Europe, at Google, other places. And you have the #1 Apple Business Chart podcast, Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat, which you just did, right?
Yeah, I did an episode just down the hall with a couple of creators.
That's awesome. So happy to have him here, and we are going to chat a little bit about a bunch of stuff. But let's talk about the book for a minute. I was struck by this because I think a lot about headlines and descriptions and how you describe things. And you got the book here in the UK is titled what?
The Joy of Work in the UK.
The Joy of Work, which I know what you're playing off of there. And the tagline was what? 30 ways to fix your work culture and fall in love with work again, right?
Exactly.
But you changed it when you went to the US. Same book, different title, right?
Yeah. The podcast is named Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat, which is actually after a Fatboy Slim Calvin Harris song.
Yeah, right.
And my publisher in the UK had never heard of that song, so didn't want to call it that. And the publisher in the US hasn't heard of that song either, but didn't like A Joy of Work. So
yeah. But I really like the tagline, 30 hacks for bringing joy to your job, I think is awesome. I like that tagline better.
Largely because a lot of us, find ourselves in jobs where maybe the day we got our jobs, we were really thrilled and we texted someone, we were really happy, and then teleport on 2 years, we're in our jobs feeling exhausted. I think over half of British workers report feeling burnt out at some point during the year. And we sort of find ourselves just not really enjoying our jobs anymore. So it was specifically about that.
And what are the essence that you bring to that? I mean, I understand why you wrote the book, to kind of bring that joy back, but can you distill it down into a couple of key principles? Or it's like, I know, buy the book, but you should all buy the book. But, let me know what you think.
But the interesting thing for a lot of people, so I mentioned over half of workers are burnt out. And if you just look at some of the stats of the way we're working, the overall story isn't a good one. So, over half of all workers are burnt out. 40% of people say they don't have a single friend at work. And so we've sort of created a version of work which is exhausting and often quite lonely. One of the things that, we all take for granted, the fact that we do email on our phones, but the transition from the world of work before we did that to now has seen the average working day go up by 2 hours a day. So we've created a version of work where we're working longer. And so, my feeling was, what was the way to try and improve that, get a slightly more sustainable version of work?
Yeah, and you talk a lot about work culture and idiot bosses and stresses in the workplace. Let's talk a little about idiot bosses, because that's, I don't know, can be one of the most stressful things out there at all. You work for somebody who you don't respect as a bad boss. What do you do if you have a bad boss, or if even worse, you have a great boss and they leave and all of a sudden a bad boss comes in?
Yeah, the number one thing that correlates with people saying they're unhappy in their job is their manager. So people generally resign from a manager, and you can have two teams in one office sitting 30 yards apart, and some of them will say we love our job and some of them hate our job. So it largely comes down to what your manager's like, and so that was the interesting thing for me. I was witnessing, in a tech firm, I'd worked in Google, I'd worked in YouTube, I'd worked in Twitter, and probably if you don't work in those environments, you think, right, they must be incredibly creative, they must be incredibly productive, and I was seeing really big levels of burnout in those jobs. So a lot of that is down to the way that people are working, the demands that bosses are making on people. And so I was just interested, sort of the book is a bit like a cookbook. Mm-hmm. So, cookbook you don't read from start to finish, but you need a risotto recipe or you need a soup recipe, you go to that page, and it was more, if you've got a team that hasn't got any connection between them, what do you do? If you've got if you're feeling exhausted, what do you do? So it's trying to be very directional about the small things that we can do to improve the way that we experience work.
So what's the bad boss recipe, or at least one little tip dealing with the
so I created
boss?
Something called the Bad Boss Helpline.
Yeah.
And
I love this. So,
and I created some YouTube clips for that. So I had people phoning me up saying, so if you go to badbosshelpline.com, you'll see you can phone it, you can email, and largely because the things we were hearing from people were their boss one of the things we hear quite often is people say their boss wants to know where they are all the time, or why aren't they online. So, if you work in an environment where you're allowed to work from home, your boss will constantly be asking little questions to just check if you're there. And so, the way that someone described it to me is this guy said, look, I feel like I'm one of the good guys, but I feel like there's an 18th century mill owner inside of me, where, if people aren't at their desks at 9 o'clock or 9:30, I want to know why. And I think the secret is trying to overcome that, trying to get over that sense where not controlling people doesn't necessarily mean that they're not doing a good job.
I'm actually really excited about synthetic personalities, because I want to create a synthetic personality of myself. So when my boss is like, where are you? The little synthetic me pops up. It's like, right here working. Do you think that'll work?
I think we're going to go into some interesting debates. You'll know that controversy 2 years ago where Google introduced an AI, a bot that would phone restaurants, and they added ums and ahs to try to synthesize something that felt more human, and they got a lot of pushback on it. But I think, the interesting thing that we're all presented with is unequivocally in 10 years, computers will do more of our jobs than we do today. So we're in this real transition zone where none of us believed we could summon a cab with the tap of a phone, and none of us believed we could summon food that way. But in 10 years, they'll look like ancient history, and what computers do will be significantly advanced. And the areas that humans will remain in advantage, a competitive advantage, is areas of inventiveness, creativity, imagination. And so, this is an interesting forum for things like that, because we're surrounded with creators, people whose job it is all the time to think of original ideas. And a lot of us sort of hesitate, thinking maybe we work with those creative people, but we're not the creative people. But all of us are going to be sort of faced with the prospect, how can we be more inventive in our approach? And the really interesting thing, so I mentioned that on average people are working 2 hours a day on their phones, and for a lot of us it's a lot more than that. But if you're working 2 hours a day on your phone outside of your working hours, if you actually look at the stress levels, the cortisol levels of those people, the majority of those people, over half of those people, are on the highest measurable cortisol levels. So you check the stress levels, you can test people's saliva, and people are just living in that zone. And the reason why it matters is because the evidence really clearly says that stress kills our capacity to be creative. And so when we're in a zone of being burnt out, we're totally maxed out on stress, we generally aren't as inventive, as imaginative as we like to presume that we can be.
Yeah, well, the other thing that burns us out and makes us work on our phones for 2 hours and sucks out the life of our life jobs is meetings. How do we fix meetings? Because they're terrible too.
Yeah, I mean, probably the big trend in workplace culture right now, and the big thing that everyone is interested in, is either transitioning to a 4-day week or a 6-hour day. What can we do to try and push back? And the thing that always stands in the way of anyone being innovative in the way they treat work is meetings. Because meetings, the average British person spends 16 hours a week in meetings. The average manager spends 23 hours a week in meetings. So they're the biggest part of our day. And there's a strange conflict that quite often we can feel energized if we meet someone who's a client or an outside customer by a meeting. But if we're in an internal meeting, people, just our colleagues, they can feel life-sapping, they can feel there's no thrill to them. And so trying to eliminate them, I think, is probably one of the biggest challenges facing us.
Do you eliminate meetings, or do you figure out a way to do them so you get that kind of energy out of them, or is that just not possible?
The strange thing about meetings is that if you ask people the best meetings, they generally talk about the meetings that they're responsible for.
Yeah, right.
And
my meetings are great, everyone else's.
And everyone else's suck. And so just being honest about that, saying that probably, we all think our own artwork is the best artwork. We all think our meetings are the best meetings. Trying to sort of recognize that there's a bias in the way we perceive things, and just trying to, at the very least, half the amount of time we're spending them.
Yeah, and what about work culture? There's teamwork culture, company work culture. How do you build an effective culture, whether you're responsible for a team, responsible for a company, or maybe just responsible for your dog?
Yeah, look, I think this is the critical thing. A lot of us might have memories of working in environments where we say, that was such a creative time. It was such a productive time. I wish I could get back to that. And actually, once you've experienced a great culture, then part of you longs to return to that. Or, I remember vividly working in environments where my friends were working in really toxic places, and so consequently I was very aware that the components of my workplace were different to that. And that was really what I set about trying to understand. And what you discover is that, number one, there's a whole realm of science, organizational psychology, that studies how these organizations work. And so for me, it was really interesting as a lay person, as someone who did a job, coming to realize that, and I filled the book with all of this science, but how understanding the scientific principles. Probably the one thing that I would share with you here is something called psychological safety. Okay. Psychological safety is sort of increasingly becoming this buzz phrase, largely because when people study high-performing teams, they identify that this psychological safety exists. Psychological safety is sort of our ability to speak candidly to each other. So me and you are planning something, and we're building something together, and if I can tell you your idea sucks, then okay, it might be initially hard for you to take, but the work that we produce is better for that candor. But the challenge for most of us in our jobs is whether it's our boss's ideas or whether it's our colleagues' ideas, it's very difficult for us to get to that place. But in addition, psychological safety impacts us when things go wrong. So let me give you an example. If you're a police officer and you go and investigate something and something goes wrong and someone ends up in hospital or worse, then, what happens? Does that police officer, maybe a bad example, or that hospital worker, do they get blamed for that, or is it taken as that they had the best of intentions? And if you transplant that to our workplaces, so something that's less high risk, but if you're working on a project and it becomes a calamity, does your boss turn and blame you, or does your boss say, okay, so let's try and work out what went wrong? And all of these things are constituent parts of psychological safety. The woman who pioneered it was working in hospitals, and she discovered this strange thing. She could track which were the best performing teams, and there was all these scores that they all went up and to the right. They all sort of correlated with each other. The best performing teams were the best on everything, until she looked at the amount of prescription drug errors they were making. So the drugs that people were getting. And the best teams, while they were up here for most things, they were making, the best teams were making far more mistakes on drug errors than the worst teams. And she was really baffled by it. Why would the best teams be making more mistakes rather than fewer mistakes? She went and investigated it. She asked the nurses, the doctors, and she realized the best teams weren't making more mistakes. They were just admitting to making more mistakes. So if you're a nurse and your job takes you to a ward of 30 beds, and you accidentally give the medicine for bed 4 to bed 5. Now, what you do next largely depends on what you've witnessed happening around you. Psychological safety. If you know that you go and say to the person in charge, I've given the wrong medicine. Whoops. If you know that there's psychological safety and you know there's no consequence of a genuine mistake, then you'll go, I've given the wrong medicine, we need to do something. If you're in a zone where you're worried that the consequence of you making a genuine mistake is you lose your job, or you're reprimanded, or you're demoted, you just don't admit it. Yeah. And so this is what Amy Edmondson, the researcher, found. She found that the best teams were making more mistakes, largely because they were being honest with each other.
They were admitting to mistakes, exactly. The other thing I think it's interesting, and Ben brought this up in the last talk, was around trust. And so trust has got to be part of that as well. I mean, you have that psychological safety if you trust that you can tell someone that they're doing it wrong, you disagree with them, or that you're not going to get screwed if you make a mistake.
Yeah, that's it. So, the reason why psychological safety has really broken through and become a hot topic is that Google performed some people analytics. So what we're starting to see is a combination of these psychology skills with data. Mm-hmm. And for the first time, we're able to look at scale at the way that various things are working. And Google observed across 100,000 employees, they observed that they could identify when they had high-performing teams and when and less performing teams. And that might be on tech products, it might be shipping various things, it might be in the marketing team. And they observed that the psychological safety was the characteristic of the best teams.
Yeah.
And so because they witnessed it, that trust that comes with psychological safety, they'd witnessed it across 100,000 individuals. It's why the whole concept has really broken through.
So it's an amazing concept. There are, your book obviously is amazing and everyone should buy it. But I was like, you have 56 books on your other resources list on your website. You haven't read all 56 of them.
Yeah, I have, because I've done 100 podcasts.
Yeah.
And so.
Okay. What are your 3 favorites?
For me, if you're interested in the combination of psychology and big data, there's a book called Social Physics.
Social Physics.
By a guy called Sandy Pentland, which is fascinating because it takes the equivalent of these badges here and it says, how about if this was as capable as your iPhone? And so how about if this had tracking technology, all manner of sensors in it? And what they were able to do as a result was they were able to identify, they deployed them in offices. And very quickly they start building a heat map of what was going on in offices. And what they discovered was that there was characteristics, the heat maps of creative offices were all alike. And the heat maps of uncreative offices were also alike. Fascinating. So within a short period of time, they had the gathered data that was then instructional, was telling them which were good places. Here's what they found. The best places, the most creative places, was when there was more face-to-face conversation.
People moving around, right? Yeah.
People were sort of buzzing like bees, sort of going. Now, most offices increasingly are headphone wearing zones where people aren't talking to each other because they've got so many emails. And so, so you're witnessing that they're imperatives that you need, but could you try and create times of day where people chat, or maybe try and create more social meetings where there's more team discussion, as opposed to sort of, those PowerPointy meetings, so you can get in those directions. Another book recommendation I'll give you, for me, probably the best book I've read in the last 12 months is a book by a guy called Johann Hari called Lost Connections. Ostensibly about depression. In fact, it might put you off when you see this, but actually it's more about how human beings are social and we need to connect with each other. And sometimes when we miss that, the importance of humanity and the importance of human connection, when we miss it, it's when we start feeling either depressed or we start feeling de-energized. And so he talks largely about how I think we're all aware that our relationship with our devices is this fascinating sort of distraction, disruption to the way that we've worked. I am obsessed with my phone. I love it. But I think what he ends up thinking is that we can't neglect our relationship with vitamin N, sort of nature, the role that being connected to the wider world can play.
Yeah, good stuff. I want to talk a little bit about personal branding. You've done an amazing job branding yourself and branding what you do. As you built your brand and business, what are some of the key things you learned, and what could you pass on to the audience about building their own personal brand?
I was just chatting to someone beforehand, actually, and I think one of the critical things that I've recognized is that it's far more impactful to try and find your disagreement with the world, and then and then often attention will come to that, than to feel like you're just trying to draw attention to you. And people not knowing why. So in fact, we were just chatting I interviewed Elle Mills, the YouTuber, before, and I think anyone who's familiar with Elle's content, she's not gone out and spent time hammering her social media to try and bring people to that. She's just created fascinating and brilliant and imaginative and tonally wonderful content, and people have come to it. So it's about sort of, you've got to let people know that there's a yard sale, but telling people every day there's a yard sale going on, I think probably is a bad thing to do. So, some of my best social content that's done well is where I've posted a rant about something, and the people who've discovered it have shared it, rather than me sharing it 100 times.
Right, and so talk about a couple of examples of your disagreement with the world. It's an interesting concept, but just a couple of concrete examples.
But, I'm convinced that modern work is a lie, where the number one, we don't bring any discussions about scarcity to modern work. So we've got this idea that we can work relentlessly. In fact, all of us can be on our devices till 11 p.m. just answering a quick email. We're answering email through the day. We don't take lunch breaks. Even on our vacations, we're answering email, and we're not prepared to accept that has any downside on our energy, on our inspiration, on our creativity. And it's just a lie. And, another lie, Elon Musk was out about 12 months ago talking about his own working week. And Elon Musk said, he says the minimum that people should work is 80 hours.
Yeah.
He likes to work 120 hours a week. Now, right, so let's have a look. We can actually do in experiments. We can measure people's productivity when they do things like that. And it's impossible to get the Elon curve. It's impossible to get a curve where people's productivity stays the same level for 120 hours a week. So it's a lie. And so what we find, though, is that because so few of us are prepared to say, I can't work like this. This is not acceptable for me. We find ourselves working longer and longer hours, with the consequence that levels of burnout are through the roof, that people feel like they're in unsustainable life patterns. It's only when people break that we're willing to have these discussions. And so, my feeling resolutely is it's impossible to have a regime where companies are asking people to do more and more meetings, asking people to be online more and more time, to just jump on a quick phone call. It's impossible to do all of that and to be doing the best version of our creative work.
Yeah, absolutely. We have time probably for a question or two. If anybody has a question, I will run out there. If not, we're just going to keep on going. Your website. Tell us about your website real quick, where you can find the 53 books and find the podcast and find everything else.
Yeah, so all of my stuff is eatsleepworkrepeat.com, so you'll find the Bad Boss helpline there. If you have got a bad boss, you'll find the details of how you can get in touch, and all of the stories of bad bosses. Well, here's what happens, is that if you contact the Bad Boss helpline, we anonymously send a copy of The Joy of Work to your boss. So that's the idea, is that if your boss is somehow this wretched individual who's polluting the world with his toxic management, we will send them the guide to fixing work.
So if you get an anonymous copy of the Bad Boss helpline,
Exactly that.
Of the book in your email, you know that you've been tagged. And I'm now scared.
And we've rendered some of the best stories as cartoons.
Yeah.
So a fantastic cartoonist, a guy called Drivel Siv, has turned them into animated stories.
I want to talk about that visual aspect of it, because I think that's fascinating. It's been part of your personal branding, the way you use video, but particularly the way you use these cartoons. How did you come up with that idea, and then why was that important? And how many have you done, and how many are you going to do? I know that's a lot of questions. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I've made sort of a handful of these things so far. As the calls come in, we just, myself and the illustrator just sort of say, okay, let's do this one, let's do this one. I think, my view is that with everything, people have got a short attention span and plenty of entertaining things to fill their time. So albeit I think it's a really interesting and important topic, the importance of improving management, the importance of trying to get our bosses to be better. I think the best way to try and get attention to that important topic is probably to create something that's sort of a bit entertaining along the way.
Now, you left Twitter, and you've been growing your own personal business. You've been doing some free lunch and learns and things like that. Tell me about what that was and how that works, and is that something that maybe you can offer these guys? Yeah,
the book, my book was the best-selling business book of 2019.
Which is amazing.
And so as a consequence of that, when it came out in paperback, I just said, look, I'll do free lunch and learn at a few companies. So I think that's still available. It's on the Penguin website for the next week, I think. You can still enter, and I'll come. So I'm expecting to sort of be doing a lot of shoe leather, going to see different companies.
Yeah, and will you build more of a consulting business out of that, or is it just you're gathering for the next book, or what's next?
focusing my attention on a couple of climate change things at the moment. So I want to see how far I get with those, and I don't know how far I'll get with that, but I'm trying to put all my energy into that.
So what's you can give us any little hint of where that's going?
Yeah, I think the whole discussion about ecology and climate change, I think, is so daunting for a lot of people, and so breaking it down into bite-sized chunks. What are things that people can do? I'm working on a really fascinating plastics project, sort of anti-plastics, and a climate change thing as well.
All right, Bruce Daisley, amazing stuff. You guys should buy his book if you don't have it. We could talk about this for hours, but we're out of time.
Thank you.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was great. And thank you all.